Imagine, for just a second, trying to figure out exactly who you are when your personal history is just this puzzle made of entirely different boxes.
Right. It's basically a giant contradiction.
Exactly. I mean, you have centuries under one massive empire, and then boom, a sudden jarring pivot to another completely different global power.
Oh, and don't forget a brutal World War occupation thrown in there, too.
Yeah, right over the top of these ancient tribal roots. It is, frankly, a lot to process. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tracing the psychological evolution of the Philippines.
It's such a fascinating journey, too.
It really is. We're looking at how a nation evolved from these scattered, independent tribal microstates into a unified democratic republic.
And, we're really examining how centuries of rebellion, occupation, and just, well, cultural whiplash built the highly complex sociological profile of the modern Filipino.
So to start, I mean, you can't think of national identity in the Philippines as a melting pot. It's not that.
No, not at all. It was much more like geological strata. You have this indigenous tribal bedrock, right? And every conquering empire layered their own distinct soil directly on top of it.
Just burying what was there before.
Exactly. But today, when you take a core sample of the Filipino psyche, you're looking at all those intact, overlapping layers at once. You just can't understand the modern culture without understanding the immense pressure that fused those layers together in the first place.
Right. So let's actually look at that bedrock. Because, before the Spanish arrived, the concept of a unified Philippines just didn't exist.
Wasn't even a thought.
Yeah, there was no centralized national government dictating laws from some capital city. Sovereignty was incredibly localized to what was called the barangay.
And that term barangay is honestly the perfect place to start. It comes from the word balangay, which were the Malay boats that the early Austronesian settlers arrived in.
Oh, wow. So they literally named their communities after the boats they came on.
Yeah. When they landed, they didn't fan out and build a sprawling, interconnected nation. They settled in those boat-sized kinship groups. So a barangay wasn't just a neighborhood.
It was its own thing.
Right. Each one was, for all intents and purposes, an independent microstate. It had its own distinct territory, its own people, and absolute sovereignty over its own affairs.
So they were essentially operating as these tiny, self-contained kingdoms, and each one was headed by a datu.
Yes. And the datu was the focal point of their entire societal structure. I mean, this wasn't just a mayor.
Right.
The datu was the chief executive, the primary judge who settled all disputes, and the supreme military commander. It was this intensely concentrated form of leadership.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. And beneath the datu, the barangay operated on a very specific, rigid social hierarchy that dictated every single aspect of the local economy.
Well, let's get into the mechanics of that hierarchy, because it really sets the stage for, well, everything that comes later. At the top, you have the Majinu class, right? Yeah. Which is the nobility, the datus, and their immediate bloodlines.
Exactly. The upper crust.
But right below them, you have the Maharlika. And these were the warriors. Their social contract is super fascinating to me.
Oh, it's very unique.
Yeah, because their primary function was to protect the barangay from external threats. And in exchange for risking their lives, they were completely tax-exempt.
Which is a pretty good deal, honestly.
Right, but the catch was they were absolutely bound to accompany the datu into any war or raid. So, very high stakes.
High risk, high reward. And then below the warriors, you had the Timurwa.
The freemen.
Right, they made up the bulk of the agricultural and economic engine of the barangay. But honestly, the most revealing part of this bedrock layer is how they structured the lowest tier, the slaves.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
Because the pre-colonial concept of slavery was highly stratified. It wasn't a monolith at all. You had two types, the Aliping Namahe and the Aliping Sagwagilid.
And that distinction is crucial for you to understand, because it's not what we typically picture. If we translate the Aliping Namahe into a modern concept, they were almost like a live-out contractor.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, they lived in their own houses, they maintained some degree of personal autonomy, and they could even own a portion of what they produced. But they owed specific labor to the datu. Like, they could be called upon to help farm the communal land or build structures.
Right. Whereas the Aliping Sagwagilid, on the other hand, experienced a completely different level of subjugation.
They were the ones living in the datu's house, right?
Exactly. They were completely indentured, live-in servants. But what we really need to focus on here is how someone actually fell into these categories. This wasn't chattel slavery based on race.
Which is a huge distinction.
Massive. It was almost entirely based on massive unpayable debt or being captured in a raid.
So wait, if you incur a debt you can't pay, you literally become the property of your creditor.
Exactly. You belong to them. And this rigid debt-based hierarchy is just vital to understand because it laid the absolute psychological groundwork for modern patron-client relationships in Philippine politics and society.
Well, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, the idea that a massive debt transforms your social standing and binds you in absolute loyalty to a patron that didn't just start with modern corruption, that is a survival mechanism baked right into the original bedrock of the barangay.
Which brings up a really interesting dilemma. If I live in one of these barangays and my entire worldview is dictated by my debt to my local datu, do I feel any connection whatsoever to the people, say, 3 islands over?
No, none.
So is there any concept of a unified Filipino identity at this point, or is it entirely tribal?
It is fiercely tribal. Your identity was intensely localized to your kinship group. I mean, you might trade with the barangay across the river or you might go to war with them, but you certainly didn't view them as your countrymen. To consolidate thousands of these fiercely independent microstates into a single, cohesive identity, it took something massive. It took an overwhelming external force.
It took a common enemy. And that enemy arrives in 1521, led by Ferdinand Magellan. He initially plants a flag and names the archipelago the Islas de San Lazaro.
Yeah, and that arrival kicks off a 333-year period of Spanish colonial rule.
3 centuries.
Unbelievable, right. And the Spanish realized immediately that they couldn't govern thousands of independent datus. They had to forcefully centralize the government.
You swept them all up.
Exactly. They took all those scattered microstates and violently brought them under one sweeping administrative umbrella, governed from Manila, but ultimately answering to Madrid.
But, they didn't just change the administrative borders, they fundamentally attacked the concept of personal identity. And there's a specific moment in the sources that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, the surnames.
Yes. Governor General Narciso Claveria mandates the use of Spanish surnames for the entire local population. Just think of the psychological weight of that for a second.
It's staggering.
You aren't just paying taxes to a new king. You literally have to change your family name, which is the core of your kinship identity, just to fit the new empire's alphabetical filing system.
It is a total bureaucratic overwriting of the cultural baseline. You are stripped of your barangay identity. You are now a subject of Spain, categorized by a Spanish name, governed by a centralized Spanish authority, and aggressively pressured to adopt the Spanish religion.
But you can't just mandate that kind of psychological erasure without incredible blowback. I mean, human nature doesn't allow for that. The resistance to the Spanish wasn't just a few isolated skirmishes.
Not at all. It was deep generational defiance.
Take the Dagohoy Revolt in Bohol, for instance. It is recorded as the longest revolt in Philippine history, lasting from 1744 to 1829.
85 years.
Wait, an 85-year rebellion. How does a localized rebellion sustain itself for almost a century against a global empire without a centralized, well-funded army?
It survived because the motivation wasn't purely political or economic. It was deeply, intimately personal. Francisco Dagohoy didn't start an 85-year war over a tax dispute.
No.
He started it because a Jesuit priest refused to give his brother a Christian burial.
Wow. Over a funeral.
Exactly. In a culture that, even before the Spanish arrived, placed supreme value on family honor and spiritual respect for the dead, that refusal was the ultimate grievance. The Spanish had imposed this new religion and then arbitrarily weaponized its rituals against the local population.
So it's a massive collision of values. You disrespect the family honor, you deny them their spiritual rights, and you ignite a war that outlasts multiple generations. People were born, lived their entire lives, and died in the mountains of Bohol in a continuous state of rebellion over a denied funeral. It's just wild.
And that fierce protection of local sovereignty popped up everywhere. Look at the Silang Revolt in the Ilocos region.
Oh yeah, Gabriela Silang.
Right. Diego Silang initiated the uprising, but the true testament to their resolve is what happened after he was assassinated. His wife, Gabriela Silang, didn't surrender. She stepped directly into the vacuum of leadership, took command of the rebel forces, and continued the armed struggle herself.
But despite the incredible tenacity of people like Dagohoy and Gabriela Silang, these were still largely localized armed struggles.
Right.
Like, the people in Bohol weren't really coordinating with the people in Ilocos.
Right, it was very fragmented.
So it wasn't until the 19th century that we see a distinct evolution in how the resistance actually operated.
And that is the crucial pivot point in history. The resistance had to evolve from localized sword fights into a unified intellectual revolution. and that required a complete shift in tactics.
This is where Dr. Jose Rizal enters the picture. He's the national hero, but he didn't lead a literal army. He used his intellect, and specifically his writing, as his weapon.
The pen over the sword.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He forms the La Liga Filipina and writes these two explosive novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. He's exposing the abuses of the Spanish friars and the colonial government. But, how does writing a novel actually unify a fractured archipelago?
Because a novel, especially in that era, functioned as an incredible technology for empathy. Before Rizal's writings, a worker in Manila might suffer under a cruel Spanish official, but he thought his suffering was isolated.
Like it was only happening to him.
Right. Rizal's novels allowed that worker to read about the exact same abuses happening to a family in Laguna or a student in Europe. It allowed them to realize, wait, we are all experiencing the exact same subjugation.
That's powerful.
Rizal didn't just expose the Spanish, he essentially invented the concept of the Filipino public by giving them a shared narrative. He provided the intellectual framework that proved they were one people.
He builds the psychological unity. But parallel to that intellectual awakening, you have Andres Bonifacio, who looks at the situation, realizes that the Spanish are never going to grant peaceful reforms, and decides it's time to return to the sword.
Yeah. Bonifacio provides the physical mechanism for independence. He founds the Katipunan, a secret revolutionary society with a singular, explicit goal, absolute, armed separation from Spain.
So Rizal unified their minds, and Bonifacio organized their hands to physically break the chains.
Exactly, two sides of the same coin.
And it actually works. After 333 years of colonial rule, the revolution succeeds. The Spanish are ousted, but the concept of a free Philippines doesn't even get a chance to breathe.
Barely a gasp of air.
Right, the Spanish flag comes down, but sovereignty is just a mirage.
Because the geopolitical reality of the late 19th and early 20th century just crashes down on them. The archipelago is essentially handed over to the Americans, and then shortly after that, plunged right into the horrors of World War II under Japanese occupation.
The Americans step into the vacuum left by the Spanish. But they realize what the Spanish learned the hard way. You cannot hold a massive, scattered archipelago with just soldiers and guns. The resistance is way too stubborn.
You need a different kind of weapon.
Exactly. You need a weapon that alters the mind, not just the borders. Both the Americans and later the Japanese realized that the most effective tool for long-term control of a populace is education.
It really is. Let's unpack the mechanics of that. The American regime arrives, and in 1901 they bring in the Thomasites, named after the transport ship Thomas that carried them across the Pacific.
The teachers.
Right. These were American teachers, and their mission was to establish a comprehensive public school system. They are teaching math and science, yes, but they are also mandating the English language and deeply instilling American democratic ideals.
And the ultimate irony of the American occupation is that they use the tools of liberation, public schools, mass literacy, and democratic philosophy as profound instruments of subjugation.
It's so insidious when you think about it.
It's a brilliant form of soft power. You don't have to force a population to obey at gunpoint if you can teach them from childhood to think in your language, to revere your historical figures, and to genuinely admire your culture. You align their internal worldview with your external geopolitical goals.
It's a fundamental rewiring of the societal hard drive. But just as that new American operating system is taking root, World War II erupts. The Japanese military arrives in 1942, and they look at this deeply entrenched Western educational system and decide, well, it has to go.
They systematically dismantle the educational infrastructure set up by both the Spanish and the Americans.
They literally tear up the textbooks.
Yeah, I want you to imagine for a second putting yourself in a wooden chair in a Manila classroom during this era. In one generation, your teachers are telling you the American Constitution is the ultimate truth and that English is the language of global progress.
Right.
And then, just a few years later, a completely different military administration marches in, physically shreds those exact books, and mandates that you learn Nipongo.
Unbelievable.
They heavily promote a love for labor and vocational training, specifically designed to eradicate Western influence and mold you to serve their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Talk about cultural whiplash.
It is severe cultural whiplash. You are being told that everything you learned yesterday is a lie, and the new truth is whatever the occupying army dictates. How do you maintain a stable sense of reality when the truth changes depending on whose flag is flying on the flagpole outside your school?
That whiplash created incredibly complex, fractured reactions within the population. During World War II, the resistance didn't look like one unified front at all.
No, it was completely splintered. You had the Hukbala Hap, which originated as a peasant and worker movement that fought a fierce, uncompromising guerrilla war against the Japanese forces. They were fighting for the land and their own survival.
But then you have the other side.
Exactly. On the exact opposite side of the spectrum, you had the Makapilis. This was a Philippine militia organized by pro-Japanese generals to fight alongside the Japanese military.
So you have Filipinos fighting a guerrilla war against the occupation, and Filipinos taking up arms to defend that very same occupation. It perfectly illustrates how deeply the psychological landscape had been fractured by all this.
Which really brings us to the sociological aftermath. You cannot subject a people to centuries of this shifting imperial rulers, bloody localized rebellions, the arbitrary changing of surnames, and the constant rewriting of their classroom textbooks without it leaving a permanent, indelible mark on their collective psyche.
Right. The sources we looked at define culture as the complex whole of knowledge, beliefs, arts, and customs, and how that whole is transmitted through socialization. So what happens to the transmission of culture when the culture is constantly under siege?
It forces the culture to adapt into a state of permanent survival. The specific sociological traits that define the modern Filipino character, as outlined in the historical data, are largely coping mechanisms born from this exact turbulence.
So let's look at a few of those traits because they're fascinating. First is pakikisama, which is the deep-seated tendency to yield to the majority or to authority
Right.
in order to maintain peace and harmony.
Well, think about it. When you live under an authoritarian colonial rule, whether it's an unpredictable Spanish friar, an American administrator, or a Japanese military commander, standing out or causing interpersonal friction can literally be deadly.
Yeah, you become a target.
Right. Yielding to the group consensus becomes a vital survival strategy. You keep your head down to keep your head attached.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Then there is the concept of bahala na, which is often translated as fatalism, or leaving things to fate.
Again, if your destiny is constantly being dictated by a governor general thousands of miles away in Madrid, or a policymaker in Washington, or a military commander from Tokyo, you develop a very rational sense that the macro events of your life are simply out of your control.
You just have to let go.
Exactly. Bahala isn't laziness. It's a psychological pressure valve. It's a coping mechanism for existing in a state where you have no true sovereignty over your own future.
You also see a heavy reliance on euphemism, which is stating unpleasant truths as pleasantly and indirectly as possible. Again, if you are navigating a rigid social hierarchy imposed by an occupying force, bluntness is dangerous. You learn to soften the blow to avoid offending the person holding the gun.
Absolutely.
But above all, overriding every other trait is this extreme, almost impenetrable emotional closeness and security within the family.
And that family closeness is perhaps the most defining trait of all. When the state is entirely unreliable, when the national government is a foreign entity that might change its laws or its language tomorrow, who do you trust?
You can't trust the system.
Exactly. You cannot trust the system. You can only trust your blood. The family becomes the ultimate safety net. It is the only institution that hasn't historically abandoned them.
But we have to acknowledge the darker side of these adaptations, too. The historical record explicitly discusses the societal weaknesses that stem from this exact same turbulent past. Things like extreme personalism, a deeply ingrained colonial mentality, and the Kanya-Kanya syndrome, which roughly translates to each his own.
Yeah, a colonial mentality is the internalized subconscious belief that the culture, the products, or the ideas of the colonizer are inherently superior to your own indigenous culture.
Which is tragic.
It is. After 333 years of being told your native ways are backwards by the Spanish, followed by decades of American schools teaching you that English and Western ideals are the pinnacle of civilization, it creates a deeply rooted psychological complex.
Huh.
You begin to view your own reflection through the judgmental eyes of your conquerors.
And the Kanya-Kanya syndrome is really the shadow side of that extreme family closeness we just talked about.
Precisely. If the family unit is the only thing that matters, the only thing that keeps you safe, then the broader public good often falls by the wayside. Kanya is a hyper-individualistic or hyper-familial focus where you protect your own circle, even at the expense of the community.
It's just sociological survival mode. I mean, the colonial mentality and the Kanya-Kanya syndrome make perfect, terrifying sense when you look at the history. Surviving meant either adopting the new colonizers' ways so you didn't become a target, or fiercely protecting no one but your own immediate family from the crossfire.
Right, because you couldn't rely on anything else.
You couldn't trust the overarching system, so you learned to game the system to protect your own. It's an incredibly logical response to an utterly illogical and unstable history.
And understanding that causal relationship, how a 333-year occupation or an 85-year rebellion over a denied funeral, or the sudden violent shift in a classroom language directly wires the psychology of a modern population is the real value of studying this history. We aren't just reciting dates here, we are looking at the architectural blueprint of a society's mind.
We really are. We've drilled down through a lot of complex layers today. We started with the bedrock, those independent boat-named barangays, where a datu ruled and a debt-based hierarchy laid the groundwork for modern politics.
Right.
We traveled through 333 years of Spanish rule, where your very surname was altered, but where writers like Renzal engineered a shared national empathy. We navigated the soft power educational whiplash of the American Thomasites and the brutal culture-shredding occupation of the Japanese.
It's been a long road.
It has. All of these historical tectonic plates collided over and over again to forge the unique, resilient, and highly adaptable sociological web of modern Filipino culture.
And as we step back from this historical timeline, it's really worth reflecting on the tools of empire. We saw how the Americans used the Thomasites and how the Japanese used vocational schools to quietly reprogram the minds of the youth to fit their geopolitical agendas.
The soft power.
Exactly. Education and information were their most effective weapons. In today's hyper-connected, globalized world, we no longer have occupying armies marching into our classrooms. But you have to ask yourself, who or what is the new colonizer of our education and culture? Is the internet the new Thomasite, quietly rewriting our societal norms, our values, and our psychological baselines without a single ship ever having to dock on our shores?
Man, that is a chilling thought. When the history books are written about this era, what will they say shaped your identity? Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.